The wind swept fiercely across the wide-open runway at Joint Base Andrews, carrying dust and an unspoken tension that seemed to hang in the air. Flags snapped sharply against their poles, the sound echoing like distant cracks of a whip. The gray morning sky loomed overhead, heavy and expectant, as if it too understood the weight of what was to come. Private Ethan stood tall, unwavering in the face of the relentless wind. He was a Marine, solid, disciplined, and unshakable. His posture was immaculate, back straight, shoulders squared, boots polished to a mirror shine, and his pristine white cover, the formal hat of the Marine Corps, perfectly balanced on his head. From the outside, he was a picture of stoic professionalism, but beneath his calm exterior, his heart thudded steadily in his chest. Today was not just another day. President Donald Trump was arriving. Ethan reminded himself why he was there: to honor the traditions of the United States Marine Corps, to embody Semper Fidelis, always faithful to his duty, his country, and his brothers in arms. Standing guard on this tarmac, surrounded by Secret Service agents and personnel moving with precision, was both a privilege and a responsibility. The runway buzzed with silent energy. Air Force One loomed in the distance, regal and waiting, while the approaching rumble of engines signaled the imminent arrival of the presidential motorcade. Ethan's focus sharpened, blocking out everything but his duty. But the wind was relentless. It tugged at his uniform, pressed against him, and whispered insistently around the brim of his cover. A Marine does not flinch, does not falter, but the wind was no respecter of rank or protocol. Suddenly, with a forceful gust, Ethan felt it. The edge of his hat shifted, and then it happened. In one swift motion, the wind lifted the pristine white cover from his head. Ethan's stomach sank as he watched it soar into the air, flipping and tumbling across the dark tarmac like a rogue feather. For a Marine, a cover was not just part of the uniform. It was a symbol of discipline, pride, and tradition. And now, his was gone, carried away by the wind, an undeniable and visible failure. Ethan froze, his training screaming at him to hold his ground. A Marine does not break formation. He does not chase after what has been lost. Yet, deep within, panic clawed at his chest. The motorcade was nearing. The president would see this, the Marine without his cover. What would his commanders say? His fellow Marines? His family back home? The wind howled louder, as if mocking him, but Ethan stood still, rigid, silent. He could do nothing but watch as his hat tumbled farther away, and with it, a piece of his pride. Without warning, a powerful gust of wind barreled across the runway, relentless and unyielding, like a force determined to challenge everything and everyone in its path. Flags snapped violently, the sharp sound echoing off the wide tarmac, and jackets flapped like sails caught in a storm. For a fleeting moment, Private Ethan felt it, that tug at the edge of his immaculate white barracks cover. A hat so pristine it seemed untouchable, but nature didn't care. Before he could react, the hat was ripped clean off his head. It happened so quickly, yet felt painfully slow. The white cover, so bright and proud just seconds ago, was now tumbling across the dark asphalt like a rogue paper caught in the wind. It skipped and flipped erratically, blown farther and farther away, every rotation making it smaller against the vastness of the runway. And to Ethan's horror, it rolled straight toward the approaching motorcade, the president's motorcade, with its fleet of black SUVs and limousines moving like a shadowy serpent across the tarmac. Ethan froze. A Marine's duty, above all, is to remain immovable, unshakable, like a monument carved from stone. Discipline was everything. Protocol was sacred. Breaking formation was not only unthinkable, it was unforgivable. Ethan could hear the voice of his drill instructor echoing in his mind. sharp and unforgiving. A Marine does not flinch. A Marine does not move. You are a wall. You hear me? A wall. And yet, there his cover lay, a stark white blemish in an otherwise scene of perfect order and discipline. It didn't belong on the ground. It didn't belong anywhere but on his head, where it symbolized everything he had worked for: honor, pride, and the legacy of the Marine Corps. To see it out of place, rolling, vulnerable, and dirty, was almost unbearable. The air around him felt electric, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan's fists clenched tight at his sides, the soft leather of his gloves creaking under the strain. His jaw locked, his back stiffened, and still, he did not move. He could not move. His pulse pounded in his ears, deafening him to everything else, and his thoughts raced like a drumbeat of panic. What would they think? His fellow Marines stood perfectly still, their gazes locked forward as if nothing had happened. But he knew they'd seen it. They had to have seen it. How could they not? The cover, his cover, was halfway across the tarmac now, rolling toward the commander-in-chief like a mocking symbol of failure. And the motorcade was getting closer. Ethan's face remained a stoic mask, but shame burned hot in his chest, spreading like wildfire. 1,000 humiliating thoughts clawed through his mind. Would the president see? Would the Secret Service say something? Would his superiors call him out later? Their disappointment sharp and stinging? Ethan knew what this looked like: sloppiness, failure. And for a Marine, there was no worse offense. But worse than all of that was the helplessness, standing there, rigid and still, while his hat, his symbol, lay out of reach. Marines were men of action. They didn't stand by while problems rolled past them. And yet, here he was, quietly, without moving his lips. Ethan whispered the only words he could think of: "Lord, help me get through this moment." It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a desperate cry. It was a plea, a small, silent prayer sent upward through the whipping wind and roaring engines. In the chaos of his mind, those words grounded him, even as the world seemed to spin faster. And then, just as suddenly as the hat had left his head, something unimaginable happened. From the corner of his vision, Ethan saw movement, not from the wind, not from the motorcade, but from someone. The approaching SUVs slowed, their engines humming like a distant warning, and the side door of the lead vehicle opened. Ethan didn't dare look. He didn't dare break his posture, but he felt it. A presence, a shift in the air. The world, for a moment, seemed to tilt on its axis. The footsteps were faint at first, muffled against the roar of the wind, but they grew steadily louder, closer. Ethan's spine tingled with dread as he realized what was happening. This couldn't be right. It couldn't possibly be what he thought it was. And yet it was. President Trump paused mid-stride. The movement was small, almost imperceptible at first, but to those watching, it felt like the world had suddenly slowed. He wasn't a man easily thrown off by the chaos of a strong wind or the precise hum of an approaching motorcade. Instead of continuing on, instead of ignoring what had happened, he broke away from the rhythm of his entourage. The Secret Service agents, always alert and ready, shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward the president's unexpected movement. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Calmly, deliberately, President Trump stepped forward, the sound of his polished shoes tapping lightly against the tarmac barely audible over the gusting wind. Every eye, though trying to remain discreet, turned in his direction. It wasn't every day that the leader of the free world chose to pause a carefully orchestrated event. But there he was, breaking from the scripted path, seemingly unbothered by the eyes of his security, the cameras, and the swirling tension of the moment. Private Ethan, frozen in place, didn't dare move. He didn't even breathe. He had felt shame burning like a brand in his chest just moments earlier as his white barracks cover tumbled helplessly across the runway, carried by the cruel wind. Now, with the president approaching, that shame was replaced by something far more powerful, a deep, overwhelming sense of disbelief. What was happening? The wind whipped again, this time hard enough to send dust scattering into the air. It tugged at President Trump's dark overcoat, making it billow around his frame. But the man remained unfazed, with a calm precision that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the wind. The president bent down and picked up the runaway hat. His movements were slow, deliberate, and there was something about them, something almost reverent, that made Ethan's throat tighten. The hat, the proud, pristine white cover that symbolized Ethan's honor, pride, and duty, was gently lifted from the tarmac. For a moment, it looked small, insignificant, in the president's hands, but there was no mockery, no hint of irritation in his expression. Instead, there was a quiet warmth, an unspoken understanding of just how much that piece of uniform meant to the Marine who wore it. President Trump turned toward Ethan. The Secret Service agents hesitated, eyes darting as if unsure whether to intervene. But the president's demeanor was calm and resolute. There was no stopping him. The world might have been watching. Cameras might have been rolling, but it didn't matter. In that moment, the man who held the highest office in the land didn't see the wind, the crowd, or the spectacle. He saw a young Marine who needed a gesture of reassurance, and he chose to act. Ethan's gaze remained fixed ahead, unwavering and disciplined, but he could feel the president approaching. The seconds seemed to stretch longer than they should, each step echoing like a drumbeat in Ethan's mind. Sweat prickled at the back of his neck, though the cold wind bit at his skin. He braced himself for what came next, struggling to keep his composure, praying that his face betrayed none of the emotions churning in his chest. And then the president was there, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his presence cutting through the wind's chill. With surprising gentleness, President Trump reached up and placed the hat back onto Ethan's head. He didn't simply set it there, either. His hands carefully adjusted the cover, tilting it slightly to ensure it was perfectly aligned. He smoothed the brim just once, as if to say, "There. It's exactly how it should be." For Ethan, the gesture was more than just the return of his hat. It was a restoration of his dignity. The president took a small step back and looked him squarely in the eyes. Ethan, though rigid and upright, felt the weight of that gaze, a gaze not of judgment, but of understanding. There was a kind of gravity to it, like a father looking at a son who had done his very best. Then, President Trump gave him a solid, reassuring pat on the shoulder. The gesture was brief but powerful, like a shot of adrenaline straight to the heart. "You're doing great, son. Stand tall." The words were spoken quietly, but in that moment, they might as well have been shouted over a mountaintop. They cut through the wind, the noise, and the lingering tension with a clarity that seemed to reach deep into Ethan's soul. It wasn't just encouragement, it was validation, a reminder that even when things went wrong, when life, or in this case, the wind, tried to knock you down, you could stand back up with pride. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight, his chest swelling with something he hadn't expected to feel: gratitude. Everything stilled. The wind, though still howling in the background, felt quieter. The distant engines of the motorcade hummed like a low murmur. The world around him seemed to slow as Ethan stood there, his white barracks cover once again perched proudly on his head, his pride and composure fully restored. At that moment, the president wasn't just a political figure. He wasn't the commander-in-chief or the leader of a nation. He was a human being, a man who, despite the weight of the world resting on his shoulders, chose to stop, notice, and uplift someone who needed it. For Ethan, it was more than an unexpected moment. It was a divine one, somewhere deep within him, past the disbelief and the gratitude. Ethan felt something else, God's presence. It was as though the Lord himself had sent a quiet message through the smallest of actions, a reminder that grace, humility, and kindness can come from even the most unexpected places. The president turned and continued on, the motorcade waiting for him just a few steps away. But Ethan remained rooted where he stood. His heart pounded, not from panic or fear this time, but from something far greater. He had been seen. He had been lifted up. And as he stood tall, cover once again in its rightful place, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He would remember this moment for the rest of his life. The video spread like wildfire, igniting every corner of the internet and media outlets with an energy that no one saw coming. It began quietly, shared by someone who had happened to capture the moment on their phone. A few seconds of footage where the leader of the free world broke from protocol, bent down, and returned a Marine's hat to its rightful place. But what started as a small, private incident quickly became something far greater. Within hours, the clip was everywhere, broadcast on televisions, replayed on news sites, and shared across social media feeds. People watched it again and again, unable to look away. Some saw humor in it, a gust of wind, a hat rolling away, and the president chasing after it like something out of a light-hearted movie. Late-night hosts made jokes about the wind being more determined than most politicians. Memes flooded the internet, showing the hat with captions like, "The wind's only target today," or "Not even the Marines are safe." But for others, for those who looked deeper, it wasn't just a funny moment. It was something far more meaningful. A still image captured mid-action of President Trump bending down, his coat fluttering in the wind, his hands cradling the Marine's cover with care. The look on his face wasn't one of annoyance or obligation. It was one of quiet respect. It was humility in action. Millions of people saw that moment as a reminder, a lesson, even of something greater. There, on a chaotic runway, amidst a whirlwind of cameras, protocol, and movement, the most powerful man in the world chose to pause. He chose to notice a small, seemingly insignificant detail, a fallen hat, and in picking it up, he restored not just the hat, but also the dignity of the Marines standing at attention. For people of faith, it struck an even deeper chord. To them, it wasn't just an act of respect, it was an example of humility, the kind spoken of so often in Scripture. The words of Matthew 23 verse 12 began to appear in comment sections and headlines alike. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. It was a rare moment that transcended politics, a moment where humanity shone through. People put aside their divisions, their opinions, and their differences to appreciate something simple yet profound. A leader stooping down to lift someone up, far away, in a quiet living room lit only by the soft glow of a television screen. Ethan's family sat watching the footage on repeat. They hadn't seen it live, but as soon as the story broke, friends and neighbors began calling, texting, and sending them the clip. "Did you see this?" one friend had written, attaching a link to the video. "Isn't this your Ethan?" His mother sat on the edge of the couch, her hands gripping a tissue, tears welling in her eyes as the scene played out for the 10th time. She didn't cry out of sadness, but out of something deeper, pride, relief, and gratitude all mixed together. Next to her, Ethan's father, a grizzled Vietnam veteran whose face had weathered decades of life's storms, sat silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the screen. He wasn't a man prone to showing emotion, but when the president placed that hat back on Ethan's head, his stoicism cracked. He reached up to wipe his cheek, his voice rough as he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, "Son, that wasn't luck. That was God reminding you that honor and faithfulness never go unseen. His words hung in the air, filling the room with a stillness that no one dared break. His wife turned to him, surprised by the tremor in his voice. But he didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he just sat there, the glow of the television reflecting in his eyes as the screen replayed that same quiet moment again. The president, the Marine, and the wind that seemed to carry a message far beyond what anyone could see. That night, as Ethan sat alone in the quiet of his barracks, the weight of the day finally settled on him. The world outside was still alive with noise. He could hear the distant hum of conversations, the scrape of boots against concrete, and the occasional clang of equipment somewhere down the hall. But inside his small room, it was just him and the silence. He sat on the edge of his bed, his white barracks cover cleaned and restored, resting carefully in his lap. His thumb ran absent-mindedly over the brim, tracing its edge as his mind replayed the events over and over again. The moment the wind tore it away, the shame of standing helplessly, the sudden shock of seeing the president himself retrieve it, and then those words, "You're doing great, son. Stand tall." Ethan's throat tightened just thinking about it. Out of instinct, he reached into the drawer of his small metal desk and pulled out his Bible. Its cover was worn from use, its pages soft beneath his fingers. He flipped through it slowly, letting the familiar rustle of the thin pages calm his racing thoughts, until his eyes fell on John 13 verses 14 to 15. "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Ethan read the passage again, the weight of the words pressing into him like a gentle hand on his shoulder. He had always been taught that God worked through people, through moments, and through actions, no matter how small. That day, on the tarmac, a gust of wind, a fallen hat, and the simple, deliberate act of a leader had turned into something much bigger than any of them. It wasn't about politics, pride, or rank. It was about humility, grace, respect. And as Ethan closed the Bible and placed it back on the desk, he realized something that would stay with him forever. God often tests us in the smallest, most unexpected ways. The question isn't whether the test is fair or convenient. The question is how we choose to respond, how we choose to stand tall even when the wind knocks us down. With that thought in his heart, Ethan looked down at the cover in his lap one more time, a quiet smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He stood up, set the hat carefully on his desk, and turned out the light. Tonight, the world was talking about what had happened. Tomorrow, it would move on. But for Ethan, the lesson of the day would last a lifetime. The story struck a chord across the nation, echoing deeply with veterans, soldiers, and everyday Americans. It wasn't just another viral video or a fleeting moment on the internet. It was something far more profound. It was a reminder, timeless and simple, of what humility, leadership, and grace can look like in the most unexpected places. Within hours of the video spreading, it began popping up on every corner of social media. News stations aired the footage on repeat, accompanied by commentary that ranged from thoughtful reflections to outright admiration. But beyond the media noise and headlines, it was the people, ordinary citizens, men and women of faith, and those who had served, that breathed life into the moment. Churches across the country began to share the video during Sunday services, projecting it onto their screens like a modern-day parable. Congregations sat in silence as they watched the leader of the free world stop, stoop down, and lift up something so simple, a Marine's hat. It wasn't the act itself that moved them. It was the heart behind it. Pastors seized on the opportunity to deliver a lesson that seemed almost divinely timed. "This is what Christ-like love looks like," one pastor said from his pulpit. gesturing to the screen. It's not about power or position. It's not about grand gestures that the world applauds. It's about seeing someone in need, stepping out of your own path, and lifting them up with care. That's what Jesus taught us to do. Another pastor, in a small church in the Midwest, held up his Bible and spoke with quiet conviction. Leadership and grace go hand in hand. The Bible says in Matthew 23 verse 12, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Let this moment be a reminder to all of us that humility is a strength, not a weakness, and that God often shows His favor in the smallest, most humbling moments. As the video made its rounds, the comment sections below it turned into a testament of faith and inspiration. Some wrote with awe and reverence, "This is God at work. I see His hand in this." True leadership isn't about towering above others. It's about serving them, even in the smallest ways. God bless the Marine Corps. And God bless America. This is what we need to see more of. Others shared their personal stories, connecting deeply to the moment. Veterans wrote of their own experiences of leadership and sacrifice, moments where someone had shown them grace, lifted them up, or restored their pride during times of hardship. One Vietnam veteran commented, "I've seen men humbled in the toughest of places, and I've seen leaders rise to show what real character looks like. This is leadership. This is respect. God bless that Marine." The story resonated far beyond viral shares and headlines. It reached people who had never worn a uniform but understood the value of dignity. It reached families sitting at their dinner tables, parents pausing to show their children the video as a teachable moment. "Look at this. This is what respect looks like. This is what it means to care for others, no matter who you are." In homes across the country, the video sparked conversations that went deeper than politics or ceremony. It was about humanity, how we treat one another, how we lead by example, and how the smallest gestures can have the most lasting impact. For Private Ethan, the event took on an entirely different meaning. To him, it wasn't about going viral or having his face plastered across news screens. It wasn't even about the president himself. It was about what the moment revealed. Sitting in the quiet of his barracks later that evening, Ethan turned the day's events over in his mind, replaying them like a scene from a film. He thought of the wind tearing through the tarmac, the shame he'd felt as his white barracks cover tumbled away, and the disbelief as he watched the president stop to retrieve it. He could still feel the weight of the hat as it was placed back on his head, the reassuring pat on his shoulder, and the words, simple but profound, "You're doing great. Son, stand tall." It wasn't about the hat. It wasn't about protocol or ceremony. It was about the lesson. Sitting there alone, Ethan opened his Bible, thumbing through its familiar pages until his eyes fell on James 4 verse 10. "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up." He let those words settle into him. Their truth is clear as ever. God had a way of revealing His favor in the smallest, most unexpected places, like a gust of wind, a fallen hat, and the humility of a leader who chose to stop. For Ethan, the day wasn't just a test of composure. It was a moment of revelation. He realized that God often allows challenges, not to shame us or tear us down, but to remind us of what truly matters: faith, humility, grace. In that fleeting moment on the tarmac, the message had been loud and clear. Even in life's humbling challenges, God's favor shines brightest. The story of Private Ethan and President Trump was more than a moment caught on camera. It became a powerful reminder of humility and respect that transcends power, position, and circumstance. In a world often consumed by pride and status, this simple act, a leader bending down to return a Marine's fallen hat, stood out as a symbol of strength through humility. For Ethan, what first felt like a moment of failure became one of grace and revelation. The president's actions, placing the hat back on his head with care and saying, "You're doing great, son. Stand tall," restored more than just Ethan's dignity. It reminded him of God's presence in unexpected places. That night, as Ethan reflected, he turned to Mark 10, verse 45. "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." He realized that God often uses small, humbling moments to reveal his love and grace. This story resonated far beyond the runway. Churches, families, and communities shared it as a testament that God works through simple acts to create ripples of hope and inspiration. It was about seeing others, honoring them, and lifting them up. What about you? Do you see God's hand in life's unexpected moments? Remember, even when things go wrong, God is still there, working, guiding, and calling us to serve others with humility and love.